On a Christmas Eve buried beneath snow in the mountains of Montana, an old road disappeared, and two elderly hearts began to fail in the cold. A man with a dying heart, a woman who refused to let him give up, and a night so cruel it tested every promise they had ever made to each other. What happened next was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it became a miracle written in silence, loyalty and one choice to keep going. If you have ever faced a night where hope felt far away, this story is for you. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from and leave a comment below. And if stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles matter to you, please press subscribe to support this channel and help us share more stories like this with the world. Snow came early to Redwood Pass, Montana, that year, not with celebration, but with quiet authority, as if the mountains themselves had decided to seal every promise of easy passage before Christmas could arrive. Redwood Pass was never a city meant for noise or hurry. It was a high country town, pressed between pine forests and narrow roads, a place where winter shaped both the land and the people who stayed long enough to grow old. By late afternoon on Christmas Eve, the sky had lowered until it felt close enough to touch, and snow poured steadily, thick and soundless, swallowing rooftops, road signs, and the thin illusion that modern life could always outrun weather. Miles above town, beyond the last plowed road and the final flicker of electric light, stood a small cabin crouched against the slope like an aging animal that knew how to survive by not moving. Inside that cabin sat Arthur Collins, 79 years old, a man whose body had thinned with age but whose posture still carried the quiet discipline of decades of labor. Arthur was tall once, broad through the shoulders when he worked the railroads in his youth, but now he appeared narrower, folded inward by time and a heart that no longer obeyed him. His hair, once dark, had faded to a pale gray that matched the frost gathering along the cabin window. His face was deeply lined, not with bitterness, but with the patient creases of someone who had learned early that life did not rush for anyone. Arthur sat hunched beside a heater that no longer heated much of anything. It clicked weakly, coughing out brief bursts of lukewarm air before surrendering again to the cold. His breathing was shallow and uneven, each inhale sounding like it had to negotiate its place in his chest. 2 days earlier, his heart medication had run out. Arthur had insisted it would be fine. He always did. He had survived layoffs, injuries, and winters when food ran thin. He believed, perhaps too deeply, that endurance itself was a kind of medicine. Across from him stood Helen Collins, 76, his wife of 58 years. Helen was shorter than Arthur, compact and sturdy in a way that suggested a lifetime of adapting rather than resisting. Her back was slightly bent, not from weakness but from habit, shaped by years of lifting, tending, and staying when others might have left. Her hair, pulled back into a simple knot, was white now, though her eyes remained sharp and alert, the blue of someone who had spent most of her life scanning horizons, watching weather, watching children, watching Arthur. Helen's face held warmth even in worry, but there was steel beneath it, forged by loss. She never spoke of easily, and responsibility she never set down. The phone lines had gone silent the night before. No dial tone, no signal. Helen had tried twice, then stopped. Panic wasted energy, and energy was something they could no longer afford. She wrapped a scarf tighter around Arthur's shoulders, her hands moving with practiced gentleness, the same way they had when he came home bruised from long shifts on the railroad or coughing from dust and cold. "We'll wait until morning," Arthur whispered, his voice thin but deliberate, as though speaking the words might make them true. He was not a man who liked to admit fear, especially to the woman who had followed him through half a century of uncertain decisions. Helen studied him carefully. She knew the sound of his breath when it was merely tired. She knew the sound when it was dangerous. This was the second kind. There was no accusation in her gaze, no anger, only clarity. "We won't make it through the night," she said softly. The words hung in the air, heavier than the cold. Arthur did not argue. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, looking not at the heater or the snow pressing against the windows, but at Helen. If this was fear, it was shared fear, and that made it bearable. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if performing a ritual they had rehearsed in some quiet corner of their minds without ever naming it. Helen layered coats over Arthur's thin frame, adding a second scarf, a third pair of socks. Arthur insisted on buttoning his own jacket, fingers trembling but determined. Pride, even now, mattered. They left a note on the small wooden table near the door, written in Helen's careful handwriting. It did not explain much. It did not need to. Anyone who found it would understand. Outside, the storm had grown thicker, the kind of snow that erased tracks almost as soon as they were made. The road beyond the cabin was officially closed. Arthur had helped build parts of it decades earlier, back when men still believed steel and gravel could tame mountains. He knew better now. Roads did not close because of rules. They closed because nature decided so. They stepped into the storm together, not because they were reckless, but because staying felt too much like surrender. Helen held Arthur's arm, her grip firm, guiding his pace. Each step sank deep into the snow, cold biting through boots and fabric. The wind pressed against them, testing balance, testing resolve. Somewhere below, the town of Redwood Pass lay quiet, unaware that two of its oldest residents were walking toward it, not out of courage, but out of love sharpened by necessity. Arthur stumbled once, then steadied. He did not complain. He had learned long ago that complaining never shortened the distance. Helen kept her eyes forward, focused on the dark line where forest met road, counting steps without realizing she was doing so. Christmas Eve passed without carols, without lights, without witnesses. Only snow, breath, and the slow, determined movement of two lives refusing to end quietly inside a cold cabin. Above them, the mountains disappeared entirely, erased by white. Below them, the road waited, indifferent. And between those two truths, Arthur and Helen Collins walked, carrying with them nearly 6 decades of shared mournings, shared griefs, shared stubborn hope, unaware that this night, closed roads and all, had not yet finished deciding their fate. Night deepened over Redwood Pass with the slow patience of something that knew it would win. Snow continued to fall, no longer softly but with intent, driven sideways by wind that curled through the trees and swept across the narrow mountain road. Visibility shrank to little more than the reach of headlights, and even those seemed swallowed almost immediately by white. A patrol truck moved carefully through the storm, tires crunching over compacted snow, engine humming low and steady. Inside sat Deputy Samuel Brooks, 45 years old, a man shaped by both discipline and loss. Samuel was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that suggested he had once smiled more easily. His hair was dark, but thinning at the temples, his jaw permanently set as if holding something back. Years on the force had given him calm reflexes and a controlled voice, but it was the absence in his eyes that told the deeper story, an absence carved there 3 winters earlier. Samuel had volunteered for the Christmas Eve shift without hesitation. In Redwood Pass, holidays were often quiet, but for Samuel they had become something else entirely, a stretch of hours to endure rather than celebrate. His teenage son, Luke, had died in a winter accident on this same stretch of mountain road, a night when ice and speed and youth had aligned in the worst possible way. Since then, Samuel worked more nights, drove more roads, and stayed moving long enough to avoid thinking too hard about empty bedrooms and unopened gifts. In the passenger seat sat Bear. Bear was a 7-year-old German shepherd, a retired canine whose working days had officially ended the year before. His coat was thick and dark, black saddle over tan, dusted now with flecks of gray around the muzzle that made him look perpetually thoughtful. His ears stood alert even at rest, and his amber eyes missed very little. Bear's body was solid, powerful without excess, built for endurance rather than speed. He had spent most of his life trained to search, track, and protect, and retirement had done little to dull those instincts. Samuel and Bear had been paired for nearly 6 years before Bear's retirement. In that time, they had learned each other's rhythms with the quiet intimacy of partners who did not need to speak much. Bear knew when Samuel's shoulders tightened from stress and when silence meant grief rather than calm. Samuel knew Bear's warning growl, his curious whine, and the stillness that meant something was wrong. The radio crackled briefly, then fell silent again. No signal, no dispatch updates. The storm had taken care of that. Samuel adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the road ahead. He was not looking for trouble. He rarely was. But nights like this demanded attention. Bear shifted slightly, lifting his head. Samuel noticed immediately. Bear did not move without reason. The dog's nose lifted, testing the air through the cracked window. His body leaned forward, muscles tightening beneath his coat. A low sound emerged from his chest, not a bark, not aggression, but something closer to concern. "What is it, old man?" Samuel murmured, easing off the accelerator. Bear's gaze fixed ahead, cutting through the snow as if he could see beyond it. Then Samuel saw them. Two shapes materialized through the storm, barely distinguishable from the swirling white. They moved slowly, unevenly, bent against the wind. For a moment, Samuel wondered if his eyes were playing tricks on him. People did not walk this road in storms like this, not unless something had gone very wrong. He braked gently, bringing the truck to a stop. The moment the engine idled, Bear whined softly, tail stiff, eyes locked on the figures ahead. That was all the confirmation Samuel needed. He opened the door, the cold rushing in hard enough to steal breath, and stepped out. The first figure was a man, elderly, tall but stooped, his frame trembling with exhaustion. His face was pale beneath the frost, lips tinged faintly blue. The second was a woman, shorter, sturdier, gripping the man's arm with both hands as if sheer will could keep him upright. Her face was flushed from cold, eyes sharp with fear and determination. As Samuel approached, the man's knees buckled. The woman reacted instantly, shifting her weight, bracing him against her own body despite the obvious strain. "We're not lost," she said quickly, her voice steady but tight. "We're just trying to get help." Samuel knelt beside them, his training taking over. He took in details fast: the man's labored breathing, the way his hand trembled against his chest, the way the woman positioned herself slightly in front of him, protective without thinking. "I'm Deputy Brooks," Samuel said calmly. "You did the right thing stopping me." The woman nodded, though her eyes never left the man. "My husband, Arthur," she said. "He has a heart condition. We ran out of medication." Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. There was no ambulance coming up this mountain tonight. He knew that without checking. The road was barely passable even for his truck. "There's no medical transport getting here in this weather," Samuel said carefully, choosing honesty over false comfort. "But we can't leave you out here." Bear stepped forward then, moving slowly, deliberately, until he stood beside Arthur. The dog pressed his body gently against the man's leg, lending warmth and balance. Arthur's shaking eased slightly, as if the contact itself anchored him. Arthur looked down at Bear, managing a thin, tired smile. "Good dog," he whispered. Bear did not wag his tail. He simply stayed. Samuel assessed their options quickly. Driving them all the way down the mountain to town risked getting stuck. Leaving them here meant certain disaster. There was only one viable choice. "There's an old ranger cabin not far from here," Samuel said. "It's registered as an emergency shelter. We can get you warm and stabilized there." The woman, Helen, studied his face for a brief moment. Years of shared hardship had taught her how to read people quickly. Whatever she saw, there was enough. "Okay," she said. Samuel helped Arthur into the back seat, Bear hopping in after him without hesitation. Helen climbed in beside her husband, one arm never leaving his shoulders. Samuel closed the door, returned to the driver's seat, and turned the truck carefully back toward the narrow service road leading to the shelter. As they moved, Bear remained pressed close to Arthur, his presence steady and quiet. Samuel glanced in the rearview mirror once, catching the reflection of two old souls and one aging dog bound together by necessity rather than choice. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent as ever. But inside the patrol truck, something fragile had shifted. Hope, perhaps. Or simply the refusal to let a night like this end badly if it did not have to. The road ahead was still closed, but Samuel drove on anyway. The ranger cabin appeared out of the storm almost without warning, its outline emerging from the white like a memory refusing to stay buried. It stood just off the old service road, half hidden by pines bent low under the weight of snow. The structure was small, square, and unremarkable, built decades earlier for emergencies that most people preferred to believe would never come. Its wood siding had faded to a dull gray, and the roof sagged slightly at the edges, but the building remained upright, stubborn in the way things often were in the high country. Samuel eased the patrol truck to a stop and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by wind sliding across the walls of the cabin. He stepped out first, boots crunching in deep snow, and moved quickly to the door. The lock resisted for a moment before giving way with a dull crack, as if surprised to be needed again. Cold air spilled out when the door opened, stale and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and old pine. The cabin had not been used in months, perhaps longer, but it had not been abandoned. Samuel flicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the interior. A wooden table, 2 benches, a small iron stove set against the far wall, shelves stocked with emergency supplies, blankets sealed in plastic, water jugs, a first aid kit yellowed with age. "Still standing," Samuel muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He moved with practiced efficiency, the habits of law enforcement and emergency training guiding his hands. Blankets came first, then firewood stacked neatly beside the stove, dry despite the storm. He struck a match, shielding it with his palm, and fed the flame carefully until it caught. The fire took slowly at first, then steadied, orange light flickering across the cabin walls. Arthur was helped inside next. Without the wind clawing at him, the exhaustion hit harder. His body sagged as Samuel guided him to a chair near the stove. Arthur's skin was cold to the touch, his hands trembling uncontrollably. His breathing remained shallow, uneven, as if each breath required conscious effort. Helen knelt beside him immediately, her movements calm but urgent. She rubbed his hands between her own, whispering to him in a low voice meant only for the two of them. Her face, lined and tired, held no panic now, only focus. Helen had learned long ago that panic solved nothing. What mattered was staying present. Bear entered last. The German shepherd paused just inside the doorway, amber eyes scanning the space before choosing a spot near Arthur's feet. He lay down without command, his body angled protectively toward the old man. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, a quiet counterpoint to Arthur's struggle. From time to time, Bear lifted his head, ears flicking toward the door, listening to the storm as if it were an adversary that might try to return. Samuel knelt beside Arthur, checking his pulse. It was weak and irregular, but still, there. That alone felt like a small victory. "I have advanced first aid training," Samuel said, his voice low and controlled. "I can help stabilize him, but we need to let the storm pass before we move again." Helen looked up at him. Her eyes searched his face, not for reassurance, but for truth. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "We'll wait," she said simply. Samuel retrieved the first aid kit and began working carefully. He checked Arthur's temperature, wrapped additional blankets around his shoulders and legs, and helped him sip small amounts of warm water once the stove had heated it enough. Arthur's shivering gradually lessened, though his breathing remained fragile. "You did the right thing leaving the cabin," Samuel said quietly, more statement than comfort. Arthur managed a faint nod. "Didn't feel right staying," he whispered. "Not after the phone went dead." The fire crackled softly, its warmth beginning to push back the cold that clung stubbornly to the cabin. Snow continued to pile against the windows, turning the outside world into a shifting wall of white. Time slowed, measured now in small tasks and quiet breaths. Helen sat close to Arthur, never letting go of his hand. Her posture was steady, but Samuel noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she leaned slightly toward her husband, as if daring his body to fail her. Helen was not a woman who asked much of life, but she asked everything of herself. Bear shifted closer, resting his head on the floor near Arthur's boots. From time to time, Arthur's fingers brushed the dog's fur, the contact grounding him. Bear did not move. He did not need praise or commands. This was work, he understood. Samuel stood near the door, keeping watch, listening to the wind batter the cabin. He had spent years responding to emergencies, but moments like this, quiet, suspended, were the hardest. There was no action to distract from thought, no sirens, no radio chatter, just people waiting. He glanced at the old supply log hanging by the door. The cabin was still listed as an emergency shelter, though few remembered it. A detail filed away in Samuel's mind, something to revisit when the storm was over. Arthur drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Each time his breathing changed, Helen stiffened, then relaxed again when it steadied. Samuel checked his pulse periodically, careful not to disturb him more than necessary. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy yet. Snow continued to fall, relentless and thick, erasing tracks almost as soon as they were made. The world beyond the cabin might as well have ceased to exist. Inside, however, warmth grew, not comfort. Comfort was too much to ask, but enough. enough to breathe, enough to wait. Samuel sat on the bench opposite Arthur, resting his elbows on his knees. Bear lifted his head briefly, eyes meeting Samuel's. There was something unspoken there, a shared understanding, born of long partnerships and quiet loyalty. Samuel reached down, resting a hand on Bear's back. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, restrained but present. They would stay here. That decision had already been made. The mountain would decide when it was done with them. Until then, the cabin would hold, the fire would burn, and the 3 lives inside would remain suspended between danger and hope, waiting for the night to loosen its grip. The storm did not end all at once. It loosened slowly, like a clenched fist learning to open, leaving behind a quiet so deep it felt almost deliberate. Snow still brushed against the cabin walls, but the wind had softened, and the world outside settled into a low, patient hush. Inside the ranger cabin, the fire burned steady now, its light warming the wood and casting long shadows that moved gently with each breath of air. Arthur slept in the chair closest to the stove. His head leaned slightly to one side, chin resting against his chest, mouth parted just enough to let shallow breaths pass. In sleep, he looked smaller, as if age had finally claimed ground it had been negotiating for years. His hands, wrapped in blankets, twitched occasionally, responding to dreams neither he nor anyone else could name. The steady rise and fall of his chest was fragile but present, and that presence mattered more than anything else in the room. Helen sat beside him, her back straight despite the long hours and the cold that still crept through the cabin's seams. She did not sleep. She had learned long ago that rest came later, when danger passed or when there was no longer anyone left to watch over. Her face was calm now, but her eyes remained alert, following every change in Arthur's breathing, every small movement of his hands. Care had shaped her life, and she carried it with quiet authority. Samuel sat across from them on the wooden bench, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. Without the need for constant action, time stretched in uncomfortable ways. The silence pressed in, not threatening, but insistent. It was the kind of silence that invited memory. Bear lay on the floor near Arthur's feet, his body curved protectively, head resting on his paws. Though his eyes were closed, his ears flicked now and then, responding to subtle sounds, the crackle of firewood, the soft shift of Helen's weight, the distant settling of snow on the roof. Age had slowed him, but vigilance still lived in his bones. Samuel's gaze drifted to Helen, and he noticed then the worn leather pouch she kept tucked close to her side. It was old, softened by years of handling, the edges rounded and darkened. She had not let it out of her sight since they arrived. The pouch seemed out of place among the emergency supplies and utilitarian furniture, an object that belonged more to a life than a shelter. Helen followed his gaze and offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I always carry these," she said quietly, as if explaining herself to the room rather than to Samuel alone. She opened the pouch with care and removed a bundle of folded papers, their edges yellowed and fragile. Letters. Dozens of them, tied together with a thin piece of twine that had been replaced more than once over the years. "Arthur wrote to me every week when he worked the railroads," Helen continued, "even after we married, even when he was home. There was no pride in," her voice only affection tinged with something older and heavier. "He said writing helped him remember who he was when the days got too long." Samuel nodded, though he had not expected the sudden tightness in his throat. He understood routines that existed to survive time, rather than mark it. Helen carefully unfolded one of the letters, smoothing it with her thumb. The paper was thin, the ink faded but still legible. She did not read it aloud at first. Instead, she stared at it, her gaze softening as memory filled the spaces between words. Samuel glanced away, not wanting to intrude. His eyes landed instead on the fire, watching flames shift and dance. The warmth felt unfamiliar, not physically, but emotionally. He had grown used to cold rooms and empty houses. A single line caught his eye as Helen refolded the letter. He did not mean to read it. It simply surfaced, unguarded. "If you ever can't find me, wait. I'll walk back to you." The words struck him harder than any raised voice or sharp memory. They slipped past his defenses with ease, lodging somewhere deep and painful. Samuel swallowed, his jaw tightening as he looked down at his hands. He thought of Luke, of the night the call came, of the hospital corridor that smelled of disinfectant and grief, of the way he had searched faces afterward, friends, neighbors, strangers, waiting for someone to walk back to him and undo what had happened. No one ever did. Bear lifted his head then, eyes open, watching Samuel. The dog rose slowly and crossed the small space between them, resting his head against Samuel's knee. The weight was gentle but undeniable, anchoring him in the present. Samuel did not move the dog away. He rested his hand on Bear's neck, fingers sinking into thick fur, feeling the steady warmth there. The contact grounded him in a way he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Helen noticed but said nothing. She refolded the letters carefully, returning them to the pouch, and placed it back at her side. Some stories were meant to be shared, others simply needed to be seen. The fire crackled. Arthur shifted slightly in his sleep, then settled again. Outside, snow continued to fall, but softer now, less aggressive. Samuel leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. He did not push the memories away this time. He let them sit beside him, Luke's laugh, his impatience, the way he had always run ahead without looking back. The pain was still there, but it did not consume him. It existed, and so did he. For the first time in years, Samuel did not feel the need to escape the silence. He stayed with it, breathing slowly. Bear's steady presence reminding him that some things remained even after loss. The night stretched on, patient and watchful. Inside the cabin, 3 generations of experience, endurance, care, and grief coexisted quietly. No miracles arrived, no sudden answers. Only the fragile, necessary act of staying. And sometimes, Samuel realized staying was enough. Morning came quietly to Redwood Pass, not with light, but with a subtle change in the air. The storm did not disappear, but it loosened its grip, as if exhaustion had finally reached even the mountains. Snow still fell, though lighter now, drifting instead of attacking. The wind receded into the trees, leaving behind a silence that felt cautious, almost respectful. Samuel stood by the cabin door, scanning the road below through a narrow break in the snowfall. Visibility was still poor, but no longer impossible. The service road was barely passable. Dangerous, yes, but no longer a death sentence. Behind him, the fire burned low. Arthur stirred in his chair, his breathing shallow, but more regular than it had been through the night. His face remained pale, his body fragile, but there was awareness in his eyes when he opened them. Awareness meant time, and time was something Samuel knew how to work with. "We should move," Samuel said gently, turning back toward Helen. Slowly, carefully, but waiting longer won't help his heart. Helen nodded without hesitation. She had expected this moment. Her calm did not come from certainty, but from acceptance. Some choices were simply the next right step, even when they frightened you. Arthur listened, then managed a weak smile. "Let's not give the mountain another vote," he said softly. Bear rose immediately, stretching once before standing alert near the door. Despite his age, there was purpose in his movements, the familiar readiness of a dog who understood when work called him back. Samuel packed quickly, blankets wrapped tight around Arthur, emergency supplies secured. He supported Arthur carefully as they moved him to the truck, Helen staying close, her hand never leaving her husband's arm. Bear jumped into the back seat first, positioning himself beside Arthur as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The descent began slowly. The patrol truck crawled along the narrow road, tires crunching over ice and packed snow. Samuel kept both hands firm on the wheel, eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Every curve was a calculation. Every sound mattered. Inside the truck, Arthur sat slumped slightly, his breath coming shallow and uneven once more. The warmth from the cabin fire had helped, but the effort of movement was already taxing him. Helen watched him closely, her face composed but her body tense, as if bracing against an invisible blow. Bear shifted suddenly. His ears snapped forward, his body stiffened. A low, sharp bark cut through the quiet of the cab, not loud, not panicked, but urgent. Samuel's heart jumped. He glanced in the mirror at the same moment Helen gasped. Arthur's hand had flown to his chest, his face tightened in pain, breath hitching sharply. Then his hand fell away, limp, fingers curling inward as if grasping for something that was no longer there. His head rolled back against the seat, eyes unfocused. "Arthur," Helen whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Samuel pulled the truck to the side immediately, braking hard but controlled. Snow sprayed up around the tires as the vehicle stopped. He was out of the driver's seat in seconds, opening the back door and lowering Arthur carefully onto the seat. Arthur was not fully unconscious, but he was slipping. His pulse was faint, irregular, barely there. The cold, the stress, the exertion, everything had converged in this moment. Samuel's training took over. He laid Arthur flat, checked airway, breathing, circulation. Breathing was shallow, pulse erratic. Not a full cardiac arrest, not yet, but dangerously close. The cold had slowed Arthur's body, buying seconds that might otherwise have been lost. "Helen," Samuel said firmly, meeting her eyes, "I need you to stay with me. Talk to him." Helen nodded, tears streaking down her face as she leaned close, gripping Arthur's hand, whispering his name, reminding him of mornings and small joys and the simple fact that she was still there. Samuel began compressions carefully, controlled and precise, adjusting his pressure to Arthur's fragile frame. He counted under his breath, focusing on rhythm rather than fear. Bear barked once more, then circled tightly before sitting down near Arthur's head, perfectly still. His eyes never left Arthur's face. This was not confusion. This was training. Years of drills and instincts converging into silence. Time stretched thin. Samuel's arms burned, but he did not stop. He watched Arthur's chest, listened for any sign, any resistance, any breath that did not need to be forced. Then it happened. Arthur's body shuddered faintly. A weak, fragile gasp escaped his lips. Barely more than a whisper of air, but unmistakably real. His chest rose on its own. Helen let out a sob, pressing her forehead against Arthur's shoulder. "You're here," she whispered. "You're still here." Samuel stopped compressions, monitoring Arthur closely. His pulse returned, not strong, not stable, but present. Enough. Bear stood and pressed his nose gently against Arthur's cheek, then settled back beside him, as if satisfied that the moment had passed. Samuel exhaled slowly, only then realizing how tightly he had been holding his breath. They stayed there for several minutes, the truck idling softly, snow drifting around them. No one spoke. Words would have been too small for what had just happened. Helen finally looked up at Samuel, her eyes red but steady. "God didn't forget us," she said quietly. Samuel glanced at Bear, then back at Arthur, who was breathing on his own now, shallow but alive. "No," Samuel replied. "He just sent help on 4 legs." Bear's tail thumped once against the seat, restrained and unapologetic. When Samuel finally eased the truck back onto the road, he drove even more carefully than before. The mountain had tested them, and lost, for now. The road remained dangerous. The storm was not fully gone, but Arthur Collins was still breathing, and sometimes that was the only miracle a winter night could offer. Winter loosened slowly around Redwood Pass, not surrendering all at once, but retreating inch by inch the way it always had. Snowbanks remained tall along the roads well into January, their edges dulled by grit and time, but the mountains no longer felt closed. The road that once vanished beneath white had reopened, scarred and narrow, yet passable again. Arthur Collins survived. The words settled gently into the town, spoken first by a nurse at the small medical clinic, then repeated by neighbors, then by no one at all, because survival did not need to be announced once it was known. Arthur's heart remained fragile, his strength reduced, but he was alive, sitting upright in a chair by a window, learning again the shape of ordinary mornings. Helen never left his side. In the weeks that followed, she moved with a new rhythm, slower, more deliberate, as if each step carried added weight now that she understood how easily life could slip away. She laughed more softly, cried more freely, and held Arthur's hand with a steadiness that came not from fear, but from gratitude sharpened by memory. Samuel Brooks returned to his routine, if it could be called that. He drove the same roads, answered the same calls, and filled out the same reports, but something fundamental had shifted. The nights felt less hollow. The silence in his house no longer chased him from room to room. He still missed his son. That loss had not softened, but it no longer defined every breath. Bear remained at his side. The German shepherd's age showed more clearly now. His steps were slower, his muzzle whiter. Yet there was peace in him, the kind that came from having answered the last call he would ever need to. He slept more often, but always near doors, always positioned as if the world might still require him at a moment's notice. It was a quiet morning when headlights appeared on the service road leading up toward the ranger cabin. Samuel noticed them first while reviewing paperwork at the station. The report crossed his desk without ceremony. 2 civilians requesting access to the emergency shelter for a visit. He already knew who it would be. He drove up alone, bare in the passenger seat, snow crunching beneath the tires. The cabin stood as it had before, weathered, humble, but solid. Smoke curled from a small fire pit outside. Arthur and Helen stood near the door when Samuel arrived. Arthur looked thinner, his movements cautious, but his posture was straighter than Samuel remembered. He wore a heavy coat and leaned slightly on a cane, more for reassurance than necessity. His eyes were clear, present. Helen waved first. She always did. They had brought cookies, still warm in a tin wrapped with care. They had also brought a wooden sign, hand-painted and sealed against weather. Arthur held it gently, as if it were something fragile. The sign read, "Winter Mercy Shelter." Arthur cleared his throat. "Didn't seem right," he said quietly, "that a place like this stayed nameless." Samuel nodded, understanding immediately. Paperwork followed. The sheriff's office approved the designation without hesitation. Radios were installed, supplies restocked, volunteers signed up, hunters, teachers, retirees, people who knew winter and understood what it could take if given the chance. The cabin changed without changing at all. It became known. Samuel was offered a transfer not long after, a desk position in the city, better hours, less snow. He considered it longer than he expected to, but when the decision came, it felt simple. He stayed. Redwood Pass did not ask much of its people, but when it did, it asked everything. Samuel had learned that some roads were not meant to be escaped, only understood, that Christmas came quietly. Snow fell again, but gently this time, drifting instead of striking. Lights appeared in windows. The road remained open. Arthur and Helen stayed home, warm and together. The cabin above town, no longer a threat but a memory, one edged with gratitude instead of fear. Samuel finished his shift early and returned to his house just after dusk. He did not turn on the television. He sat in the living room with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands. Bear slept by the door, not guarding, not waiting, simply resting. Outside, snow settled softly, covering tracks without erasing what mattered. The road had closed that night before Christmas, but it had opened again, not because winter relented, but because people chose to stay when it would have been easier to leave. And sometimes that was enough. In the quiet ending of this story, we are reminded that the miracles of God do not always arrive with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they come through a closed road that forces us to slow down, through a loyal heart that refuses to leave, and through ordinary people who choose to stay when it would be easier to walk away. In our daily lives, we also face storms, moments of fear, loss, illness, and loneliness, when hope feels distant and the night feels long. But God walks beside us even then, guiding us through small acts of courage, love, and faith, teaching us that no life is forgotten and no prayer is unheard. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe in the quiet miracles God still sends into our lives, please type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and strength in every season. And please remember to press subscribe to support this YouTube channel so we can continue bringing stories of faith, love, and redemption to you.